Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me and that you're all well. Welcome to this online event entitled Inequality and Trade Diversification. How can income inequality in Latin America be reduced beyond commodity booms? This event is co-hosted by LSE Latin America and Caribbean Center and Canning House. My name is Gareth Jones and I'm director of the LSE Latin America and Caribbean Center. I'm very pleased to be chairing today's event and welcome the Chief Executive Officer at Canning House, Cristina Cortez, Professor Vanessa Rubio, Professor Antonio Celia, Professor Diego Sanchez Ancochea, Dr. Marcela Melendez, and Dr. Amir Lebdioui. I'll introduce each of them individually in a moment, but first, a few points of housekeeping. There will be a Twitter hashtag for today's event, which is hashtag LSE Canning House, and details should be in chat or other formats. Additionally, today's event has interpretation available for Spanish and Portuguese. If you want to find that, then please look for the globe icon, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Click on that and select the appropriate language. The event is also being recorded and will be made available subsequently as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties on the LSE Latin America and Caribbean site. After we've heard from Amir and the discussants, there will be an opportunity to pose some questions and hopefully get some answers. And please look for the Q&A function again at the bottom of your screen. If you could keep questions short and perhaps also indicate who you are, and we'll do our best to collate those and present them to Amir later on. If I now pass the microphone, as it were, to Cristina Cortez to say a few words about the Canning House LSE Research Forum. Cristina, over to you.
Gareth, thank you very much indeed. Well, welcome everyone to the first report from the Canning House Research Forum at the LSE. For those of you who do not know us already, Canning House is a non-governmental think tank based in the UK, whose unique role is to promote understanding and relationships between the UK and Latin America. We are the UK's leading forum for contacts, thought leadership and pragmatic debate on Latin American political, economic, social, environmental and health trends and issues, and also business risks and opportunities. And to that end, we invest in research, we publish newsletters and reports, and we convene events to raise awareness and understanding of Latin America, to aid policy making and also to disseminate best practice. So we partner with ministers and government officials, with members of parliament, with embassies, with think tanks, with universities, chambers of commerce and companies from across the UK and Latin America. And our approach is very much independent, neutral and practical. But we are not afraid of tackling controversial issues. So Canning House has been successfully delivering insights and events on Latin America for almost 80 years. Part of our longevity is due to the dedication of successive teams at Canning House itself. The rest is explained by our unparalleled links with expert partners. So the purpose of the Canning House Research Forum is to invest in a major program of research to develop ideas and provide advice on specific policy problems and issues. And our aim basically is to fill the gap between the academic and the practical. So to advance academic knowledge, but also to offer insights of practical application to political, economic, social and business policy making. By making this investment in the forum, Canning House very much hopes that our research forum's insights will be of considerable value, not only in academia, but also to government ministers and parliamentarians, to policymakers and regulators, to opinion formers and other research institutions and think tanks, whether they're in the UK, Europe, USA, or Asia, in fact, wherever there is interest or potential interest in the region, including in Latin America itself. Canning House is particularly proud to have the forum hosted by the Latin America and Caribbean Center at the LSE, an established and proven research powerhouse whose geographic coverage and areas of interest, politics and international affairs, economics and business, governance, society and culture, very much mirror Canning House's own priorities. Now, the overarching theme of the forum is the future of Latin America and the Caribbean, with particular reference to UK-LATAM relations, but it does go wider than that. And this first piece of published research in the series is, as Gareth announced earlier, Inequality and Trade Diversification. How can income inequality in Latin America be reduced beyond commodity booms? And I'm just going to put a plug for the second piece, which is coming fast behind it, which we hope to publish on the 11th of May, which is Latin American trade in the age of climate change. So without further ado, that's just a little bit of background and introduction to this series of projects, which we are very excited about, and of which this is the first installment, as it were. And without saying anything further, I'm going to hand back to Gareth to introduce the panel and our research fellow. Gareth, back to you.
Thank you, Christina. So the way that this webinar will work is that we will hear from Amir Lebdioui, the LSE Canning House fellow, in a moment, presenting some headlines from his report. And then we'll have some commentary from four very distinguished discussants before opening up to some other questions, as I mentioned previously. Let me first introduce those discussants in the order in which we will be hearing from them. The first is Vanessa Rubio. Vanessa is Professor in Practice at the School of Public Policy at LSE. She's also an Associate Fellow at Chatham House and has had a 25-year career in Mexico public service, including serving as a senator and 3 times as Deputy Minister for Finance, Social Development and Foreign Affairs. And she is a strong advocate for the empowerment of women. Antonio Celia is Professor in Practice at the LSE Latin America Center. He's been an influential figure in the financial and industrial sectors of Colombia for 30 years and an important voice on issues of regional development, regulation and competition and corporate social responsibility. Antonio has been president of the board of Empresarios por la Educación during 6 consecutive years and has an extensive record of delivering economic, social and cultural services for deprived groups. Antonio was awarded the Order of Boyaca, the highest distinction given by the Republic of Colombia to a citizen. Diego Sanchez-Ancochea is Professor of Political Economy of Development at the University of Oxford. He's an economics graduate from the New School of Social Research. He's previously taught at the Institute for the Study of the Americas and has been a visiting fellow at the University of Costa Rica, at Flaxo in the Dominican Republic, and most recently at the Kellogg Institute at Notre Dame. He was co-editor, in fact, co-editor with me, of the Journal of Latin American Studies, treasurer of the Latin American Studies Association, and has been director of the Latin America Center at Oxford. Lastly, for the discussants, Marcela Melendez is chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at UNDP. She has a PhD in economics from Yale. Before joining UNDP in 2019, Marcela was managing partner of Econ Estudio, co-directed the Equity and Social Mobility Mission at the invitation of the Colombian government. She describes herself as an applied microeconomist with a strong focus on public policy, evaluation and design. And at UNDP, she leads the production of analytical content to support decision-making in the Latin America region. Our principal speaker today, and in this introduction, I will pass the microphone to him, is Dr. Amir Lebdioui. He's the Canning House Research Fellow based at the LSE. He holds a PhD in Development Studies from the University of Cambridge. His research lies at the crossroads between industrial policy, natural resource management, and sustainable development agenda. His research adopts a political economy approach to resource-based development, export diversification strategies, and green industrial policy. He regularly provides analysis for multilateral development organizations. And in addition to the work for the Canning House Research Forum, he's working on developing a new indicator of extractive-based development. Amir, over to you to introduce and launch this first report.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, everyone, and hello. Bom dia and buenos dias for our Portuguese and Spanish speaking audience. It's a pleasure to finally launch this report on a topic that remains at the forefront of the research and policy agenda in Latin America. I'm also very excited that we have such distinguished discussants to comment this report today. So I'm really looking forward to it. The angle of the report is justified by the fact that inequality reduction in Latin America is not impossible and has been achieved in different periods of history. But the challenge that remains is really to understand how to do it without relying on commodity booms, which are unsustainable and outside of the hands of policymakers. So this is why the first report addresses this issue in this particular way. I'm not going to leave much suspense for the presentation and start by giving the three main messages of the report. The first one is that inequality reduction should be in everyone's interest, and that includes the business elite. My colleagues at the LSE and Canning House know my obsession for metaphors, so I'm not going to disappoint. So in a way, if the bottom of the pyramid is too unstable, it is the whole pyramid that crumbles or that collapses. The second message is that we need to pay attention to pre-distribution inequality reduction in Latin America, and not just post-distribution inequality reduction, for many different reasons that will be explained throughout the report. So in a way, this is about more than just redistributing the pie, which is not going to be enough, but also breaking the mold. And the third one is that without policies to reduce commodity dependence and promote export diversification, redistributive measures, and that includes conditional cash transfers, are not enough. They provide skills to low-income groups, but without the demand for these skills at the macroeconomic level, those skills will be underutilized. So this is a bit like learning how to fish in a fishless lake. So regarding the first message on the high cost of inequality for society as a whole, in contrast to what used to be the dominant view, right, of trickle-down economics, according to which inequality shouldn't be that much of a cause for concern, because when rich people get richer, everyone benefits because wealth trickles down and through consumption and the investment effect. Like wine overflowing a pyramid of glasses. And this belief justified lower taxes on wealthier groups to stimulate economic growth that would benefit the rest of society. But in practice, very often those policies have exacerbated inequalities that have crushed the very foundations of society. As wealth remains concentrated at the top, perceptions of inequality increase and feelings of unfairness, injustice, and frustration grows, which leads to social unrest, as demonstrated by the Latin American context, especially in 2019, 2020, where inequality-induced social unrest shook several countries like Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, which have led to considerable damage to public infrastructure, as well as a loss of investment and public and private revenues. Diego Sanchez-Oncocha has a book on the cost of inequality in Latin America that really details these kind of processes. And those demonstrations have forced governments, at least some of them, to rethink their development model and policies to address growing inequalities. And is it perhaps in that light that we can understand Chile's recent elections as well? Now, I'm going to provide just a few trends because one might say, well, how can that be the outcome if inequalities have been reduced over the past 20 years? And it is true that inequality had declined in the 2000s by some measures, but in the past 7 years, those rates have stagnated. In some cases, there's been even a reversal of the progress achieved in the 2000s. In 2019, the top 10% of income earners captured more than half of the national income, while the income share of the top 1% in Latin America is by far the highest in the world and more than double the world average. That's what you can see in the figure in the top right. And that share has increased by 8% between 2014 and 2019, while the income share of the bottom 50% has slightly reduced at the same period. So this is what you can see in this graph that represents the regional average. One thing that goes without saying, but should be still stressed, is that even though we're talking about the regional trends, and there are some trends that emerge, obviously Latin America is a region that has many different countries with different experiences. So this is not exactly the same scale across the board. For example, you have countries using that measure of the top 1%, income of the top 1%. You have some countries like 3 countries actually, Ecuador, Uruguay, and Cuba, where the income of the bottom 50% is actually higher than the income of the top 1%. But still, there are some trends that emerge at the regional level. Brazil, Chile, and Mexico are almost systematically the 3 most unequal countries in the region, with the top 10% income share capturing over 57% of the national income. Bolivia, which used to have the highest income inequality rate in 2000 by several indicators, had experienced the largest drop in inequality until 2014, until seeing a flattening of the curve. The COVID-19 pandemic has made things worse in terms of poverty and inequality. Rates that have reached unprecedented levels, even compared to recent decades. The number of poor people rose by 22 million, and 8 million of which have fallen into extreme poverty. 41 million jobs were lost, which led the unemployment rates to increase by a third. And as a result, the inequality rates have increased. And they would have increased even more without some of the transfers made by governments to attenuate the loss of wage income. So, against this backdrop, what are the key constraining factors to inequality reduction in the region? 2 things I would like to talk about particularly is the high degrees of commodity dependence and the scale of the income inequality reduction needed. First, in terms of commodity dependence, that matters quite a lot in the discussion on inequality, because most of the progress achieved in the 2000s was the result of commodity-financed social spending and education policies, which led to important changes in the labor market, the expansion of the formal sector, minimum wage, and redistributive taxation. Again, some of those factors are discussed in Diego's books. The public spending on health, housing, and social protection increased, particularly in that period in commodity exporters, obviously. And in those countries, the wage differential between skilled and unskilled workers reduced at a faster speed than in non-commodity countries. And that issue matters quite a lot, because that means that income inequality reduction strategies and spending was tied to commodity price volatility. And as most of you in the audience must know, since 2015, we're experiencing a drop, a downturn of commodity prices. As a result, public investments in social provision, conditional cash transfers, and infrastructures have also dropped since then. So this is an unsustainable model that led to a reversal of the progress achieved in the 2000s. You can see that as a result, the unemployment rate has also increased across, on average in Latin America. This is the only region in which the unemployment rate has increased since 2014, and by quite a lot. So in hindsight, the way governments have spent commodity revenues, although this was tied to a social agenda, it didn't lead to significant transformations in the region's productive structures, which remain concentrated around commodities. And this remains a hurdle moving forward. The second issue I wanted to raise is the fact that because of the scale of the challenge, or the scale of the inequality reduction that is needed, redistributive taxation may not suffice. So there is often a comparison with OECD countries, right? With the assumption that this is just about, an issue of taxation. So if Latin American governments were to tax as much as these countries, they would have similar levels of post-tax inequality rates. But there are massive differences between these two country groups. While countries like Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela's pre-tax Gini coefficients are well above 60, OECD countries have Gini coefficients that are mostly in the 40s or even 30s pre-tax, which makes it easier to reach their level. And as a result, the initial income distribution is so uneven that even a major redistribution and tax reform won't do the job. Yet, because of the scale of the issue of the challenge, it may still have adverse effects on economic growth. And there are some excellent studies showing that, well, the more you rely on tax reforms, if it becomes excessive, then it starts to have a negative impact on economic growth. So in that context, it's important to stress that redistributive policies and things like wealth taxes are needed and useful, but they may not suffice on their own to reduce income inequality. And that's why attention in Latin America needs also to be given to pre-distribution inequalities. And this is the reason, this is basically why I wanted to introduce the inequality, diversification, taxation nexus, which those three dimensions are intrinsically related to one another. And economic diversification has a central yet understudied impact on inequality, because it can affect both pre-distribution and the post-distribution structure of income. The association between inequality and taxation has been relatively well studied and is quite well understood. But it's only recently, in the last few years, that studies begin to address the possible correlation between diversification and inequality and diversification and taxation. And now I'm going to go into more details showing the statistical analysis made regarding the correlation between those three elements, as well as how to explain it. First, regarding the direct impact of, or the direct relationship between diversification and income inequality. In countries that predominantly export raw materials, the diversification to more complex products with larger spillovers can help generate and distribute more wealth across society through the expansion of job opportunities for different segments of the population and expansion of choices of occupations that are otherwise limited, which is what happens if you only rely on extractives, which are capital intensive and do not absorb that much labor. And there's evidence showing that industrial employment is negatively correlated with income inequality because of the growth of a new middle class and reducing the low-income class in several developing countries. One thing to also add is that as the reverse is also true, right? As income inequality reduces, and you have a larger middle-income class, this is the group that can more easily consume locally produced manufactured goods, because low-income groups tend to spend more of their earnings on foodstuff, while high-income groups tend to spend more of their earnings on luxury goods that can be easily imported. So in a way to kind of coordinate local production with local demand, the middle-income class is key. Diversification can also have a more indirect impact on inequality through taxation. So I mentioned the well-studied relationship between taxation and inequality, right? High tax revenues can promote a reduction of income inequality because they imply a larger fiscal space for social transfers, including in the Latin American context. But diversification can also have the impact as it's positively correlated with higher tax revenues. It enables the stabilization and resilience of tax and foreign exchange revenues in the face of external shocks or commodity price volatility. So you're not putting all your eggs in the same basket. There's strong evidence also showing that export diversification fosters growth, which generates a rise in corporate and personal income, which then translates into higher tax revenues. And higher tax revenues can also promote diversification through a virtuous circle of revenue mobilization. Because as tax revenues increase, that means that more resources are available for domestic investments in productive capabilities and assets that can help the development of new sectors and activities, which in turn also stimulate increases in tax revenues on the long term. And here in the terms of the evidence, I wanted to highlight that in 2017, which is the latest year for which the most data is available, there is not a single country that had a concentrated export basket that achieved tax revenues higher than $2,500 per capita, which is quite telling. And one thing to also add is that the associations and relationships that I just mentioned between those three variables are neither linear nor automatic. They are highly dependent on the policy environment. And the policy environment can actually influence not only the nature, but also the direction of the relationships. For example, the regressive use of tax revenues can actually further promote income inequality rather than reducing it. And the same applies to export diversification. If you have a diversification strategy that is oriented towards technology-intensive sectors, that is not coordinated with the integration of unskilled low-income groups in the labor market, that is more likely to increase the demand for a select few of basically skilled workers, which will disproportionately increase their wages relatively to the wages of low-income groups. So in that sense, that type of uncoordinated diversification strategy will increase inequality rather than reducing it, which is why the policy environment is extremely important. And one policy recommendation that I'll be highlighting later as well is perhaps a two-level diversification policy, industrial policy, in which you promote sectors that can absorb low-income groups into the labor market, while also fostering opportunities for value addition towards a sector that can help economic upgrading. So this is a kind of recommendation building on the Carlota Perez's work. So that leads us to the policy implications, right? Since the policy environment matters, determines the direction and nature of those relationships. The first one I wanted to address, there's three main policy recommendations I'd like to highlight. Everything comes in three in this report. The first one has to do with the limitations of conditional cash transfers without demand-side policies. Conditional cash transfers are a lump sum cash transfer to poor families, along with conditionalities that often relate to education or health conditions. They've become increasingly used as a tool of inequality reduction since their appearance in the mid-1990s in Mexico and Brazil. And they have had some positive impact. I mean, they offer the opportunity to poorer segments of the population to have better access to education and health. However, there are some limitations that need to be raised. The first one is that it not only assumes that schooling can enable recipients to access available jobs, but it also assumes that those jobs will exist when young people enter the labor market. And there's evidence across the region also showing that, including with Bolsa Familia, which is Brazil's CCT program, that students that have benefited from the program face significant difficulties in finding good quality jobs. So this is why it's extremely important to align it, right, with demand-side policy to make sure that those skills actually exist, or those skills are actually in demand at the macroeconomic level. Which leads us to the second policy recommendation regarding the need for strategic state interventions. And here I'll be talking about industrial, education, and innovation policies. Coordinating education, social, and industrial policies is key to generate the demand for newly upskilled workers. Relying on market forces alone fails to break the cycle of intergenerational inequality, especially when we factor in the impact of social norms, professional networks, racial prejudice, and gender discrimination. Industrial policy can be broadly defined as a strategic effort by the state to encourage the structural transformation of an economy towards very often higher value-added activities and sectors. And they have witnessed a resurgence in popularity as a vital ingredient of economic diversification and sophistication, and there is a growing body of evidence showing that economic diversification cannot be achieved with market forces alone. And in most countries that have successfully diversified towards new competitive sectors and activities, industrial policy had been used, even if in disguise. And when I say disguise, because in many countries the term industrial policy is not used, even when industrial policy is used. Once I've spoke to policymakers in Latin America who said they do not do industrial policy, or they do not choose sectors, but they make strategic bets on global market opportunities, which basically was the same thing. And you have successful examples in the past of the region, right? Salmon farming in Chile, which is actually highly knowledge and technology intensive, especially when you account for the whole quality control, vaccines, cold storage systems, and so on. And Embraer, which is a great manufacturing success in Brazil, and became internationally competitive. However, with industrial policies, it's one of the things that it always depends on how well they're made. There are clear benefits, some of them I just mentioned. That also includes to guide investments towards areas where private investment had been suboptimal, but also used to balance growth and favor disadvantaged income groups or geographic areas. But there are also risks that need to be mentioned and challenges, right? It requires considerable state capacity to pick winners, to avoid risks of inefficiency and cronyisms, but also to let go of losers, firms that fail to become competitive. The political and technical ability to do that. It requires some degrees of state autonomy from private interests to avoid state capture. And the policy space for industrial policy might be constrained by trade agreements or bilateral investment treaties signed by the government. However, there are some key elements of success that we learned from past experiences and history that need to be mentioned for a successful industrial policy. The first one is the inclusion of performance requirements for firms that receive state support. And this is something that Latin American governments had not included systematically with their experiments with industrial policy in the 80s. The second one is the need to have a dialogue with the private sector to share information and solve coordination failures. It's understandable why critics of industrial policy think that bureaucrats in the capital may not know how to run a factory on the other side of the country by sitting in their office. And to some extent that is true. And this is why it's very important to have this kind of dialogue to have a retroactive feedback, to share information, and so on. Clear sector selection criteria to reduce risks of wasteful spending and cronyism. Monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to assess implementation over time. Provision of incentives rather than requirements on their own, and more importantly, the inclusion of international competitiveness as a long-term objective. The second one is education policy. So ensuring that low-income groups can benefit not only from unskilled but also skilled employment opportunities on the long term enhances the relevance of an appropriate and sophisticated education policy. And that requires not only a major increase in education spending, but also the orientation of that spending, right? It requires shaping human capital accumulation towards strategic areas, and that entails setting priorities in national education systems according to existing and future needs. And when that is not done, it can often result in skills mismatches, right? Which is a discrepancy between the skills that are possessed by individuals and the skills required for available jobs, if the economy doesn't create those jobs that correspond to the skills of individual. And the consequences are extremely damaging at several levels, at the individual level, at the firm level, and at the national level. At the individual level, that means you might have a wage penalty, right? For overqualification, which can affect your life satisfaction. And there's evidence in Latin America, given the context of decreasing returns on education. So the more you study doesn't mean the more you earn. At the firm level, it's a clear loss of productivity and competitiveness, right? Because the skills provided by the education system are not there. So you cannot grow unless you have to retrain people at your own cost of time and resources. And at the national level, it's also an increase, it can increase unemployment, especially skilled unemployment, and lose competitiveness because you're not really using your labor force at their full productivity potential. And there are examples like this, like Becas Chile, in which they used to not discriminate in terms of areas or disciplines to study, and as a result, many recipients came back with no jobs to actually utilize those skills. And recently, they've decided to start to add disciplinary priorities. The last one I was going to mention is innovation policy. Some of the past export successes in the region can be attributed to public support for R&D. So I mentioned the aeronautics sector in Brazil and the case of Chile as well, where the role of public agencies was key for the development for the emergence of high value-added and knowledge-intensive industries that did not exist before interventions. However, in recent years, Latin American governments seem to have been reluctant to adopt proactive innovation policies to promote R&D, and instead, they've relied on neutral price incentives, so tax reductions for R&D expenditures and grants, and there's very little evidence suggesting that those neutral interventions have been successful. So what is needed is not only a major increase in R&D spending, but also a new set of institutions, or at least building on existing institutions, strengthening education systems, intellectual property rights, interlinkages, and dialogue between firms, universities, public agencies, and private sector to coordinate R&D. And something to mention, which will be the topic of the next report, is that in the context of the decarbonization agenda, developing R&D capabilities around low carbon innovation could represent a promising way forward for Latin American firms, because they have more room to cause technological disruption, and it's increasingly recognized that sustainability is the next innovation frontier. Lastly, just to conclude, so in the report, one of the main messages is that the ability of states to redistribute taxes or facilitate consumption amongst low-income groups may not be enough to sustainably reduce income inequality beyond commodity booms, because those moves leave untouched greater obstacles such as limited productive capabilities and weak absorption of labor in value-added sectors. So perhaps rather than only redistributing existing wealth, reformers should implement policies to create new wealth that will be more evenly distributed with more opportunities for employment. So that increases the need to focus on combining diversification with labor demand, and justifies the emergence of sophisticated and coherent industrial education and innovation policies. The COVID-19 crisis also represents a critical juncture for rethinking industrial policy in the region. The disruptions of global supply chains in the past 2 years have shown the vulnerability of many Latin American countries that over-rely on commodity exports, tourism, and import of manufactured goods, which were badly hit by the pandemic, compared to more diversified economies. And against this backdrop, there is therefore an urgent need to rethink the importance of diversification in the context of inequality reduction to achieve both resilience, competitiveness, and productive employment that can reshape the inequality mold for the years to come, and to break free from a model that fosters inequalities and focuses on sectors making use of unskilled labor and raw materials exports rather than knowledge-intensive and complex activities. So on that note, I want to thank you very much for your attention today. I also want to seize the opportunity to thank all those experts who have reviewed previous versions of the documents and provided very useful feedback, and the discussants for the comments that they're about to give. If you want to learn more about the Canning House Research Forum, here is a link, and here are some of my contact details if you want to reach out for further questions, discussions, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amir. We'll put some of these links in the chat as well, so that they're there for a legacy for people to write down in their own time. To continue your metaphor, you've given us a lot to sort of drink in through a very rich, detailed presentation. But to help us understand it, or understand some of its implications, perhaps, I'll call on the four discussants, starting with Vanessa. From Vanessa's comments, we'll run straight to Antonio, from Antonio to Diego, and from Diego to Marcela, and then back to Amir to offer some responses. So Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gareth. Thank you so much, Cristina, for this exercise, for inviting me to be part of this panel together with Antonio, Diego, and Marcela. And let me start by commending Dr. Amir Lebdioui for this very compelling report. I definitely agree with the fact that we need to find policy options to reduce inequality in the most unequal region in the world, by the way, no? One where the 10% wealthiest concentrates 37% of the total income, and while the 40% poorest receives only 13% of that input. So definitely we need to advance in a broader sense of how we should create a more inclusive, sustained, and sustainable growth for the coming years. Definitely, I think diversification is important as a source of more and more sustained and less volatile growth. I absolutely agree with you, Amir, on this. One thing I would like to stress, though, is that it is not enough. It is a very good path. It is a very good policy option. One definitely that my own country explored since the 1990s. Perhaps from all of the countries in Latin America, Mexico is the most open and diversified economy. If we look at Mexico prior to 1994, we had 0 foreign free trade agreements. And as of 1994, up until now, we have 13 free trade agreements that give us access to 50 countries in the world. So speaking about a country that actually thought that diversification was a must to create a broader growth and hopefully a more inclusive one, I think Mexico is definitely a case. And it's a good case because that diversification has proven to give tools in order to reduce inequalities in Mexico. But again, it has also proved the fact that diversification is not enough. So when one sees, for instance, the amount or the percentage of Mexicans in the year 2000 that lacked access to health, and this is Coneval, the national institution that looks into poverty and social policy in Mexico. It's an independent body. In the year 2000, 59% of Mexicans lacked access to health, while in 2018, it was 16%. So definitely it is better 16 than 58 in terms of lack of access, but still we need to move forward. That's what I'm saying, that it is a good policy, but it's not enough. If we speak about sewage, the lack of sewage in the year 2000 in Mexico was 40%. In the year 2018, it was 6.3%. Water, it was 24%, the lack back in the 2000, now it's 7%. Electricity, it was 13%, now it's 0.4%. So definitely, this proves that diversification gives you the possibility of getting people to have more access to the basics, to food, to nutrition, to education, to housing, to services to housing. But again, it's not enough because lacks are still there. And as long as there is people lacking the basic, we still need to think about what else needs to be done, no? So definitely, I agree with that premise. And I think that Mexico is a perfect example that can be done. But again, that it's not enough. I will now go to the 3 points you stressed at the beginning, Amir. And you stressed that inequality reduction should be in everyone's interest. Definitely. I think that one thing that we should be mindful of, and we cannot stress enough, is social injustice. The fact that we had expected that in sometimes duplication or the triplication of growth output in many of our countries will at the same time, in a sort of magical way, will alleviate or would alleviate social lacks and the lack of access to the basics was not there, no? And there needs to be policies like the ones you propose in this report in order to aim for this and to create sustained and sustainable economic growth. That definitely, I think that we need to go and we need to revise the current economic model, no? We need to revise the current economic model where we cannot just sit down and look at the GDP and GDP growth and that be the only and the center of what we consider to be economic success, no? So the growth of GDP is not enough, and what we have seen in our countries is that sometimes, despite economic growth, social inequalities keep on growing, no? The other element that you stressed was the need to pay attention to predistribution. And again, I think this is something that is very relevant, breaking the mold, as you put it, because we really need to look into those market reforms that promote a more equal distribution of economic power. And again, I will put the case of Mexico in this regard, where we in 2012 decided as a country that we needed to aim for a series of second or third generation reforms in the energy sector, in education, in finance, in fiscal, in labor, in competition, in telecom industry, that could give us that pre-distribution elements to be in place. So when we were seeing all the considerations and the results of growth, these would be intertwined, producing a different result, no? One thing that I think it's a challenge for all Latin America at the current moment is that all these reforms and some of these reforms in many of the countries are at siege, and are at siege because, of course, these reforms do not report benefits from one day to the other. They take time. And perhaps as a mea culpa, I think one of the aspects is that we haven't been quite good in explaining this to the population. to explaining that it is not an energy reform that will, make that energy transition in 1 or 2 years. It takes sometimes decades to make that energy transitions, or to make that education transition to be to have a positive and a tangible effect on the lives of people, no? So I think we should be better in terms of defining priorities of these pre-distribution policies or measures. That is one challenge, but also we need to explain this better in order to find, you were talking about the political context in which all this falls, and definitely I think the new political context in Latin America, you refer to Chile, where the social contract is being redefined, no? And many of the countries are in the region are considering similar exercises. So I think that in this redefinition of the concept of growth, and in this redefinition of the social contract, whether normative or in the debate, I think we really need to have this in mind, how to create priorities in terms of the reforms that we need to engage in, but also to be able to explain the results in time better for our citizens. Finally, you also referred to the fact that without diversification and reducing commodity dependence, the conditional cash transfers are insufficient tools. I wouldn't agree more with this. I couldn't agree with more with this. But I think that cash transfers are insufficient always, because cash transfers act as something that, as an element that corrects something that is intrinsically or structurally wrong. So what you need is to take 5 steps back and correct that structure, no? And cash transfers are always there and should be there in order to provide the minimum for some, no? But also a more thorough vision of economic growth with sustainability and with inclusion will provide for those basics to be addressed since the beginning. And one thing I think we don't think about a lot, or don't discuss a lot about, is the electoral and the political nature of these social programs, of these cash transfers, because it is there and it's sometimes the elephant in the room and nobody discusses about that. What are the incentives for the politicians? What are the incentives for policymakers of getting rid of that scheme of social transfers, of tax transfers? Basically none, because what the poor in general have been constituting for many, it's basically a political base. And there is a very difficult incentive that we need to change in order for a more structural long-term vision of addressing poverty, of addressing social lacks. Because what we need to see is that there shouldn't be a political gain from that. But if the political gain is still there, and if this is still part of what is considered the political base of many, then the incentive won't be there to change the structure, no? So that's one thing I have been thinking of since I was Deputy Minister of Social Development, trying to give more science, more independent grounds, more transparency. Transparency in policy is essential, but transparency in social policy is vital in order for these to advance in a better way. So I don't want to take any longer. I just want to congratulate you for all the inputs you're giving us. There's so much food for thought in this report. But definitely, I think that we, as you concluded, need to generate new wealth. But we need to be mindful of the quality of that new wealth, and that quality needs to be that growth needs to be more inclusive, more sustained, and more sustainable. And only in that way we can be able to start to reduce inequalities, as I said, in the most unequal region in the world. So thank you, Amir. Thank you for your report, for your thoughts, and for all the elements you give us there for policymakers and for analysts on paths to move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. I'll pass the microphone to Antonio.
Hi to everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Gareth and Cristina and Amir, for proposing this conversation. Because of the constraints of the time, I'll make a short comment and question space regarding this document, which I think it aims at the key factor of our countries and maybe the future of our democracy. I agree with you in that this is a remark that little attention has been devoted to the relationship between economic diversification and inequality. Without any doubt, in Latam we have to work with more determination and especially effectiveness in pre-tax inequalities. We have done a lousy job. In some cases, we have to take into account, this is an additional consideration, that informality is a big obstacle for them. Because even though the minimum wage in most of our countries has been going up in the past 15, 20 years, it only applies to formal employees. And then informality is a huge problem, 50, 60% in most of our countries, and they don't get any type of benefits from these social policies, or which are, by the way, very poorly designed. I have no doubt that inequality reduction is a national priority. I'm translating that into Spanish using the famous term used by Alberto Lleras, perhaps the best president in Colombia in his history, 1959, Propósito Nacional. But I have a very short-term concern with poverty. The numbers of poverty are terrible. With the pandemic, we lost 20 years of advances in poverty. Because of commodities boom, we, in general, in Latin America, took advantage of this bonanza to decrease the indicators of poverty. But now poverty in Colombia is close to 40%. And you have different scenarios in Latin America regarding that variable, because you have inequalities and high poverty, inequalities, and not too complicated poverty. So we have to take that into account, because in some cases you have to have early winning situations. And what I've seen is, if you take the numbers of reduction of Gini coefficient for the last 20 years, as you put in the graph, Amir, and poverty, with poverty we got very good achievements. And for me, it's a consideration that we cannot forget. Now, I always have this question: how much inequality can we stand? How much is acceptable? 38, 40 Gini? Can we reduce from 51 in Colombia to 45? How long does it take? This recipe that you propose is effective, I think, but how long does it take? Poverty reduction, you can get results in the short term, so don't forget about that. I agree with you that the education is not enough, by the way, because it assumes that education is of good quality, and Marcela Melendez and I know that the gap between public education and private education is huge, and it's becoming worse and worse. That is a big problem that we have. So I was saying that inequality with high poverty is even more complicated. You mentioned an important number that I want to emphasize. Without cash transfer, poverty in the region would have been 30% up. That is a key thing, although they're not enough. Regarding the diversification policies and productivity, what we have found in Colombia, and I think in many other countries, in documents from Slava and Zuleta, is that you have a very high correlation between competition and productivity in the cases of Colombia. You have to work on productivity. How do you work in productivity? And then you have to start what you emphasize also is a very fluid and frequent dialogue between the private sector and the public sector. And that doesn't happen, believe me. I was in the business community for 4 years, and that dialogue is not what it should be, because we know better what to do. You have to ask me, why don't you export? Why you are not efficient? Why you are not productive? I have some answers, and many answers have to deal with, it's very difficult to export. It's not a good business. I am protected. And this is a very popular and common answer. We have a lot of protections. In our case, in Colombia, our economy is very, very close. All the indicators for the past 25 years show how difficult in Colombia is to import and export. And the other thing is that trade within Latin America is very, very poor, almost inexistent. And we have had many efforts to integrate trading communities in Latin America. And most of the cases, it fails because of ideological reasons. So there is a lot of work to do in that, because again, our economy, in the case of Colombia, Mexico, I think, have done a huge progress in that with a free trade agreement. It's a very close economy. So we have to always begin by, because when we talk about exports, because, by the way, this is different. What we want is a diversification of trade. This is a policy oriented to export, not an import substitution. Two different things. So in any case, you need business community and entrepreneurs, because they are the ones who are going to lead with your signals and with measures all this process. So that dialogue, as you remark, is very important. But again, why we are not productive, why we're not efficient, why you do not export, and you'll find very funny questions. And according to McKinsey, by the way, productivity in Colombia, low productivity was concentrated in that 82% of medium and large companies did not have updated their technology. So there is a good initiative that could be taken into account. Regarding taxes, this is another issue that we haven't been able to tackle down. Tax revenue in Colombia is way below Latin America, and Latin America is well below OECD and well below many developing countries. We are not collecting where we should. Why? Many reasons. We haven't been able to reach an agreement. I know there are a lot of group of interest, lobby from major corporations without any doubt. But we need agreements on this, because money that we have is not enough for infrastructure, is not enough for policies that we want to put in place. And then maybe the last comment is that we have in Colombia, as many other countries, we have a productive policy since 2016. When you check what has happened, nothing has happened. Nothing. It's written in a very nice paper. Many experts were dedicated to this work, and nothing has happened because, in general, the state doesn't have the capacity to execute the public policy. And then we have a big problem also, that this is a dysfunctional state. Works in some cases. I know the notion of state is very complex, very wide, but we have to work on that. What I mean by state capacity is when you deliver public policy and public goods in an efficient and an effective manner, and that doesn't happen. So another side there, and then what we have to break is this. We have to break this vicious circle between inequality, and you have to read PNUD paper by Marcela and colleagues, which gives us the keys also. Inequality, poor growth, poverty, and violence. We have in Colombia those two indicators in a very, 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 very bad and a dysfunctional state. And then how do you begin to break this? How do you build state capacity? How do you bring a business community to have a different policy? You have to build trust, which is not easy, but you have to begin, first step. And the first step has to be given by the state initially. And last comment, and I like the paper, and I think this paper should be commented in all countries, because this discussion is a key discussion. But the thing is, we know the recipe. Your paper gives a lot of very key ideas to do that. I think, but we need to remember that we need to persuade, as Keynes, essays on persuasion and convince leaders, because at the end of the day, is a voluntad political will to do what is needed to do. And in some cases, technocrats and economists need to change our rhetoric and promote this type of discussion, Canning and Latin American and Caribbean Center, to keep rolling the idea, re-roll the idea until at a certain moment we do what we need to do. Thank you. Thank you,
Antonio. It is said by some that the economy is too important to be left in the hands of economists. But however, with that, I will introduce Diego. Diego, 5 minutes for some comments, please. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gareth. So let me start by congratulating Amir and by thanking him, by thanking you, Gareth, and by thanking Christina for these opportunities. Not fantastic to be online instead of seeing you all, but it is actually fantastic to be participating on an issue that is so important. And I think the report cannot be most welcomed by linking economic inequality and economic upgrading and industrial policy, and therefore opening a whole new area for research and for discussion on what I think we all agree is one of the challenges for the region. So let me just say, I not only enjoy the paper, but I think the paper opens a whole agenda of research that I hope you, Amir, can continue, and I hope LSE and Chatham House can continue in different ways. Because I only have 5 minutes, I want to actually take 1 minute each for 5 comments. That with the primary goal of actually encouraging us and you to think about how to expand. As you will see implicitly, there are some very small disagreements, but I think more than disagreements, there are, as I say, areas for research and for thinking about how we get about the topic. The first, which I don't think it's a analytical disagreement, but maybe a marketing one, is about the dichotomy between predistribution and redistribution. So as many people now in parts of the left has done, the paper, and as I say, I think more for marketing reasons, for analytical reasons, establishes that separation and basically claims that redistribution through industrial policy might be as important or more than social policy. I have to say that I find the dichotomy, even from a marketing perspective, not particularly useful. I don't think it's either or, I think it's both. And I think your research really opens the door to see how it is both. In fact, you yourself mentioned how most successful upgrading agendas and countries, and I'm thinking, for example, here of the Scandinavian countries, were able to both modernize the economy and promote equity through the redistribution at the same time. Moreover, it was precisely about creating the virtuous circle between the two things through universal policies that created the supply of human capital and through industrial policy that created the demand for those jobs that was important. I absolutely know that you don't disagree with any single word that I have said. I just think it's actually important, maybe more useful if our agenda is the inequality agenda, to really say, look, the challenge is how we create the vicious circles instead of the either or rhetoric. Second, is the question of whether we are talking about export diversification or export upgrading. And I think the paper is not totally clear, and sometimes it's about one and sometimes about the other. And my answer is that it's primarily about upgrading, because of course that will also lead to more foreign exchange. But I was not totally clear, and I would like to hear a little bit more from you about how you see these two variables and also about how you see them connecting to each other. Third, I think an agenda that is based on export upgrading, the two-level industrial policy and the reduction of inequality that you mentioned should actually consider the insights from structuralism much more explicitly than you do. In fact, I don't want to sound too much of an academic, but I got slightly worried when you say several times that we have not explored a lot the relationship between upgrading and inequality. This is actually very true for much of the orthodox economics. Is absolutely not true for structuralism in Latin America. And I don't say this just to call for a new view of historical issues, but actually because I think bringing some of the structuralist notions, particularly structural heterogeneity, will be extremely helpful in the next wave of your own work to think about how to think about industrial policy, to think about how to introduce planning, to think about how we want to link different sectors. So I guess I would, in the next phase, I would also encourage you to build more links to both traditional, but also the new work that ECLAC is doing. Fourth, and I'm going fast because again, I'm conscious of the time and to open it up for comments from the audience. It's about encouraging us to think about how do we implement all of these things. And again, I didn't expect to see it in the document. It's just that the document left me with so much energy to encourage you to think about some of these issues. So how do we actually implement the two-level industrial policy that we keep talking about? Is it about linking productivity enhancing sectors with employment creating sectors, as probably the literature on linkages and spillovers proposes? Is it actually to think about how we move up in the technological frontier, but with labor intensive sectors? How do we actually link the two types of industrial policy that we think we need? And how do they actually require the same state capacity? Is it the same institutions, the ones that are going to support the informal sector, or as maybe we hear in a second, is going to promote the improvement of the medium and large companies, as Marcela has worked on, and I think she might reference. Is that the same as the qualities and the capacities that we need for upgrading to the technological frontier? These, of course, are not, again, questions that I would imply that you needed to answer here. I just think it's the questions that clearly the research is open, because one thing we cannot do is thinking about industrial policy for upgrading in the same way as we think about industrial policy for equality. There are obviously intersections between the two, but there are also clear contradictions between the two that I think we need to really explore in the next research. And finally, and my last point, I guess it's always about politics at the end, right? And I am actually not totally sure about your claim that promoting effective industrial policy would be easier than expanding taxation. Clearly, the evidence in Latin America is not supporting totally that claim, partly because moving away from commodities is very difficult when prices are high. That's what we saw in the 2000s. But it's also very difficult when prices of commodities are low, because maybe we lack the resources to do some of the policies and the incentives that we want. So I guess I think the next stage of the research also needs to link much more explicitly the policy agenda with the political recommendations, and needs to do it by thinking very seriously about the class coalitions, and particularly the different segments of the elite, and how we almost play different segments of the elite with each other to try to promote industrial policy. Let me emphasize to finish that the fact that I have all of these questions, I think just highlights how much the document does exactly what I think the LSE and Chatham House, you, Amir, wanted to do, which is shift the debate on some of the key challenges of Latin America. I think now that you have shifted it, it's important to start deepening on some of that research agenda in the future. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Diego. And I'll pass the microphone to Marcela.
Thank you, Gareth. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss issues that are highly relevant to the region. I share the premise that to think properly about reducing inequality in Latin America, we need to simultaneously think about economic growth. The same premise is behind the narrative of our regional human development report launched in 2021, Trapped, High Inequality and Low Growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a little propaganda. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I fully agree that exports diversification is a channel for growth that is less dependent on international market price volatility. I do agree, however, with Vanessa that it is not that clear whether it will by itself lead to more tax income and less inequality. I believe a lot of things have to happen between export diversification and actually reducing inequality. I agree that tax policy is not enough, but I would like to recommend caution not to undermine the role of taxes in reducing inequality and actually allowing export diversification. Here I agree with what Diego said. Latin America does not do post-distribution at all. Very few countries actually do it. Our income distribution changes very little in its path through the fiscal system. It actually does little redistribution, both through taxes and through expenditure. And our low tax collection is not only related to poor economic activity. In many of our countries, we also have very low tax rates and a lot of tax exemptions. We have very poorly designed tax systems that rely a lot on businesses, or primarily on businesses, for tax collection rather than on personal taxes. This is actually very costly for production and for entrepreneurial development. So we need a setup that will actually allow export diversification to flourish. And I think there we need to go back to thinking about horizontal policies. I'm going to go back to that in a second. It's also true that labor income is unequal, but capital income is not irrelevant. And capital income at the personal level is not taxed at all in most of the countries of Latin America. So there's like, to rephrase Diego, we need to think about both predistribution and post-distribution at the same time. Basically, because if we don't redesign our tax systems, there is just not going to be enough tax collection to the type of expenditure that we would need to actually become more equal societies. I worry a little bit about the emphasis on industrial policies. And I will try to make my case. In many of our countries, we don't have the basic horizontal setting so that entrepreneurship and businesses will flourish. We have tax systems that grant exceptions, usually to the larger firms, unlevel playing fields. We don't have working competition policies in many of our countries. And we don't have proper transport infrastructure, logistics, and we have a lot of red tape. So these are generalities. And I understand that probably we should, the horizontal policies, these policies that are made equal for everyone, should not be competing necessarily with vertical policies, but to recommend vertical policies before we have the basics. I think it's complicated. I think, and the other thing I'd say is that we have done industrial policy. It's not very obvious. Sometimes it's not called that way, but many of our systems actually think about targeting sectors through tax exemptions and subsidies. And there's a lot of that. And it becomes very messy when you don't have the horizontal policy or the level playing field well set up and the business environment well set up for businesses to flourish. So you mentioned very well in your report that there is a risk of capture when you target policies to specific sectors or to specific firms. We've seen a lot of that. Yeah, and then I always have the concern about picking sectors. Why would the public sector know better than people who are in business about where to put like the focus and the money? If anything, I suggest that we think about industrial policy not only in terms of targeting sectors, but rather in terms of how to shape it so that it somehow circumvents all these advantages. And there are some people like Andres Rodriguez Claire who have spoken a lot about targeting activities and inputs that are behind sectors that you want to develop, providing specific assets, providing specific infrastructure for sector development to be possible. I am more in like on that line of thought. And finally, and I close here to let you hopefully react to everything that has been said. I would never recommend price controls unless there is insufficient competition. We need competition for productivity, and we need competition to have more diversified productive sectors. They will not emerge unless we have a more competitive environment. What we usually have is a policy setups whereby we protect the rents of a very few large firms. And the way our productive sectors are organized mimics very much the way in which the income distribution is shaped, with very few giant firms on one extreme of the distribution and a lot of very tiny firms or a lot of self-employment in the other extreme. That's behind what we are saying in a recent work with Marcela Eslava. What we're looking at is the fact that we've actually allowed through specific targeted policies the survival of firms that are not so productive and that they are larger than they should be. We are saying that policies that actually aim at increasing productivity will be policies that contribute to reducing inequality. And I think there's a thought there that brings us back to the quality of our education systems and the provision of horizontal public goods. I'm just going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcela, and to Vanessa, Diego, and Antonio. Before I invite Amir to respond to an incredible range of comments and questions, I'd just like to draw in a couple of comments and questions from the other participants as well. And I suppose the lead theme in what I'm getting through the Q&A and other media for you, Amir, is in the areas in which you've already identified sort of pathways to address inequality. Are you able to identify any particular best practices, either in the public policy realm in Latin America, vis-a-vis coordinated social, education, industrial policies in any shape or form, or more widely toward promoting economic diversification? And secondly, from that sort of chat, and I guess it touches a little bit upon what Diego mentioned in some of his comments, is public policy is not going to be innocent or untouched by the political influence of elites in other ways. So how can you sort of punch through some of your, well, how would you see an ability to sort of punch through some of your policy recommendations in ways which would sort of bring the elites, industrial and non-industrial, on board with it? You started your analysis by saying that addressing inequality is good for everyone. The difficulty is not everyone might be convinced by that a priori. So how could you sort of bring the elites on board so that they don't disrupt some of the better measures that you have in mind? So with that, Amir, if and with the patience of the interpreters, I'm going to steal a sort of an extra 5 minutes at the end of this webinar. If you could sort of just come back on a couple of points from the discussants or from myself, and then Christina and I will wrap up. Thanks a lot.
I think thanks for all of you for those brilliant comments and thoughts for the discussion. I don't know where to begin because there's so many things to talk about, but I will start with, I think some of them are interrelated. So I'll start with the comment on the kind of dichotomy between taxation and structural transformation. And yeah, I confirm that this is a kind of marketing mostly difference other than ideological one, because obviously the two really go alongside one another. One of the reasons perhaps why I thought it was necessary to emphasize it this way is because of the current debate or landscape in which a lot more attention is given to solutions that focus more or less on facilitating consumption or redistributing taxes, while forgetting about the other part. So what I really wanted to do is kind of show how they are basically two sides of the same coin. And likewise with the issue of taxation and the very low tax collection in Latin America, obviously taxation, redistributive taxation needs to be on the agenda. What I wanted to show with that data is to show that it's not just by, if you just compare it with, let's say, OECD levels, for example, because the pre-tax levels are so different, it's not that just with the taxing the same, you'll get the same result. There's still a lot of leeway, and this is where structural transformation can come in. With the industrial policy discussion and focusing first on basic capabilities and so on, I think that Marcela, has a very good point. The one thing that I would add perhaps is the kind of something along the lines of the doom to choose arguments by Hausman and Rodrik, the idea that any kind of the provision of any good requires very specific inputs, and any investment in goods that are seemingly of horizontal nature will end up favoring one activity over another, or one sector over another. So actually you are doomed to choose from the very beginning. And same with the education system. There is not such thing as a horizontal education system, because whatever you actually decide to train people in, you have to choose whether you're going to train chemical engineers or mechanical engineers, right? And that distinction will have huge implications on the productive structure of the economy. So it may call for actually coordination from the beginning, even if it's in, I guess there are different ways, there are different scope of how aggressive that intervention is, or how ambitious, right? Whether it's a low-hanging fruit or a very ambitious program. But in any case, there is a need for coordination between those different stakeholders to make sure that, even the road or railway that you're building, the location of it will favor an industry over another. So a coordination is definitely needed. The other point I was going to mention about that tension, or that, let's say, the export diversification or export sophistication, that's a very interesting point. And I think that I was intentionally vague regarding the relationship between the two, mostly for several reasons, but one of them is because we're talking about this at the regional level. And to actually really understand how they interrelate with one another, or in specific, you really need a specific context of a single country, right? Whether what they need is actually more export sophistication than diversification, or whether they actually need to diversify first at all costs and have room for sophistication later, or whether they can achieve both together at the same time, right? With that two-level industrial policy that we're discussing. And that actually links to Vanessa's point at the very beginning regarding Mexico, which has achieved more diversification of exports than other countries in the region, but still has very high inequality rates along with Brazil. And that has a lot to do in Mexico with the lack of export sophistication as opposed to diversification, right? And the model of the maquiladoras, in which you have a lot of employment and manufacturing activities, but a lot of it tends to be low value added. That remains a big challenge to reducing the gap between the poor and the rich. But obviously in another country that only depends, let's say, on oil, there you might have more benefits of just putting it as in a different basket if the challenge of sophistication is too difficult to begin with. But I agree with you that this is a very interesting difference to address in future work, and yeah, looking forward to discuss some of those things commonly, perhaps. The one thing about the politics is industrial policy really easier than tax reform and so on? And again, it doesn't have to be systematically the case, but what I had in mind is the Latin American context, where you have both historically, and a lot has been written on this, the resistance of the elite against tax reforms, right? Which is one of the explanations to the low tax collection, combined with the fact that, as shown earlier, to reach income inequality, and that links to Antonio's point as well about how much inequality is acceptable. But let's say if you use the OECD as the comparator, which for good or bad reasons, to reach that level, the level of taxation that you would need would be very high, which means that in Latin American context, that means there would be even more resistance to it. And in those contexts, let's say with the reformist government, this perhaps is the situation in which you can gather more social coalitions and support for a structural transformation agenda to say, let's actually bring this forward and try to work together along with the private sector on expanding skilled employment opportunities and reducing that pre-tax distribution of income as much, so that you don't only have to rely in what would be excessively on redistributive taxation. But again, I fully agree with you that the both are necessary together, and there is a need to go beyond that dichotomy. I think that that's the main key comments that come to my attention. There are a few more, but I probably need more time to think about those, and hopefully we can keep that discussion going. I hope this is the beginning of the discussion to keep figuring out these issues, not only at the regional level, and the report meant to provoke a change in the debate, but definitely cannot be done if you remain at the regional level, right, of Latin America as a whole. But in that effort of trying to find out more suitable, precise, and politically sensitive interventions, I really hope that we can keep that discussion open and fine-tune it over time.
Thanks, Amir. We are right up against the clock, and before I pass the microphone to Cristina, just to wrap up, I just want to say thank you to you, to Diego, to Marcela, to Vanessa, and to Antonio for comments and for taking part and being so kind of constructive and a critical friend on occasion to the issues that your report raises. As I mentioned at the outset, this webinar will be available as a podcast on the LSE Latin America and Caribbean Center web landing page, and we'll obviously promote that through social media. As of now, I believe, if I've got my timings correct, Amir's report will be available on the Canning House and the LSE Latin America Caribbean Center web pages as well. And that report is available in English, in Spanish, and in Portuguese. So wherever you are comfortable, please locate that report and digest it. And if there were many questions coming through the Q&A, if you have further questions for Amir, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them through email or through other media. His details are there on the LSE webpage. I would also just like to give my thanks to the interpreters who have not only worked a little bit of overtime, but have done a sterling job through the webinar. So Cristina, to wrap up and sign off.
Thank you. And can I just first of all add my sincere thanks to Vanessa, to Antonio, to Diego, and to Marcela. Obviously, of course, to Gareth as the head of the Latin America and Caribbean Center at the LSE, and absolutely to Amir Lebdioui, our Canning House Research Fellow, for his very thought-provoking report. which has generated a lot of discussion just over the last 90 minutes and has opened up an awful lot of further avenues to explore, which I'm sure he will get after in his usual eager fashion. With great support from the LSE and from ourselves. Just one slight word of correction. I think one of our speakers earlier mentioned that this was done in connection with another house, whose name I won't mention. It is actually a joint work between the LSE Latin American Caribbean Centre and Canning House, just for the avoidance of doubt. Certainly one of the things that I was wondering coming into this was how much discussion we would get and how fruitful it would be, and it obviously has been a great discussion. But one of the things at the back of my mind was, should we just move on to the next report, or should we actually take each piece of the reports that will come out of this program to Latin America itself? I think this part one, at the very least, I think we should. So very much open to ideas on that one. Gareth and I will be comparing notes on that, I think, in due course with Amir as well. But certainly, I think this is something where, you know, the kind of debate that we're having is absolutely the kind of debate we want to have with policymakers and with those who are trying to implement these ideas on the ground. So I think we've made a flying start. Thanks once again to Amir's efforts on this front. And thank you very much, all of you, for attending. And I hope that you will join us for the next report, which, as I mentioned, Latin American Trade in the Age of Climate Change, which will be published on current estimates on the 11th of May. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.